What was the cause of the United States Civil War?
Well, don't come with an easy question or anything. I mean, I think the cause of the Civil War was basically how government was going to run, the freedoms and what people could and couldn't do. We need to have capitalism. We need to have economic freedom. We need to make sure that we do all things so that individuals have the liberties so that they can have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to do or be anything they want to be without government getting in the way.
Thank you. And in the year 2023, it's astonishing to me that you answer that question without mentioning the word slavery.
What do you want me to say about slavery?
No, you answered my question. Thank you.
Nikki Haley was asked what she thought contributed to the start of the United States Civil War, and her answer has people feeling one of two ways. One is that they think that she's ignorant or dumb for not bringing up slavery in her answer and not mentioning it. Or two, they think that she has an ideology that may be malicious or something that may be dangerous as someone to be president, that she doesn't think slavery was a major contributing factor to even include it in the answer. Now, to be fair, this person asked this question as a bait question, and it worked pretty well because now news and other people are talking about it. But Americans in general have discussed this topic in the past, and there's been different perspectives and different opinions where people were saying that it was simply states' rights or an issue of economy versus slavery. And it's actually pretty interesting because in political science as well as historical documents, there are varying perspectives and there are different pieces of information that guide authors and individuals to different conclusions. And I think it's important to look at the actual dictation, the actual documents, and look at the perspectives of these individuals and why they feel this way. And I think that once we look at that, you might have a better idea. And at the same time, facts are facts and events are events. And there's not much you can do when it comes to the United States Civil War in terms of ignoring slavery, as it was a factor and something that did happen. But we can quantify the effect and see if it's a major event or simply something that's symptomatic of a larger issue. So let's look into the different factors that contributed to the United States Civil War and see if Nikki Haley gave a good answer or not. So in order to better understand the varying perspectives and opinions around the United States Civil War, let's look at these three documents that I think encapsulates the different perspectives pretty well and examine these authors in order to better understand why they draw the conclusions that they do using the same information as the source for each of them. So starting off, we have the author Arthur Bestor. He's the author of The American Civil War as a Constitutional Crisis. We have Philip Paludan. He's the author of The American Civil War Considered as a Crisis in Law and Order. And lastly, we have James Randall, author of The Blundering Generation. Now, all these articles deal with the issues that were swathed around the Civil War. A universal issue inspected by these articles is slavery and its involvement in the Civil War. Also, the question of its importance with inciting the war is scrutinized by these articles, and different perspectives are shown in each. Another issue regarding the war is what started it is the cessation of Southern states from the Union. The validity of cessation is presented differently in each of these articles, and the legitimacy of the act as well. So it's not simply saying that the Southern states seceded and the war happened because that needed to stop. There's an actual question being posed by some of these authors saying, is cessation allowed? Is it constitutional? And from this, we see the reason for the cessation is examined and explained by all, but their explanation vary as well as their approach. The last issue to be examined is inevitably of the war and the question of whether or not it could be possibly avoided. Now, leading up to the war, there was multiple compromises being made, multiple times negotiations were attempted, and it seemed like the war was not likely until it happened. Now, the thing about this is that all articles address the possibility of a peaceful agreement being made between the North and the South, and all assert that it was actually plausible. But the complexities of the Civil War did not merely exist during the war itself. Many issues existed before and after the Civil War. Truly, the war and the context behind it is not easily defined event. The articles written by these authors all address the same topic, but each has their own approach and rhetoric. So, as mentioned, all three of these articles examine the issue of slavery, and it looks at the relationship of it to the Civil War. Now, in Bestor's article, he actually strongly focuses on the Constitution as a component in the Civil War. He exclusively uses the ideologies of strict constructionism and loose constructionism in his arguments. Now, these are judiciary terms that you may be familiar with if you're a fan of Anton Scalia, a late, great Supreme Court justice. The idea of strict constructionism and loose constructionism is something that is an ideology that is held in the Constitution Constitution. The idea being that if you're a very strict constructionist, you take the Constitution extremely literally. You do not leave a lot of room for interpretation. What the Constitution says is what goes. There's no real room for expansion or guessing what the Constitution means in certain contexts. But if you're more of loose constructionism, you kind of give a little bit more leeway. This is where cases like Roe versus Wade actually expands the idea of a right to privacy through loose constructionism, basically saying that the 14th Amendment implies a right to privacy. It's an ideology that certain justices subscribe to when making decisions in court cases, which is very important because that ends up shaping the laws and the different ideologies and precedent moving on forward from that point. Now, Bestor asserts that the clashing of these ideologies and those that held them were often minor and resolvable when involved with economic affairs. And at the same time, he explains that these ideologies could not accomplish much when involved with the controversy of slavery. Bestor also writes, the explosive force of irreconcilable constitutional theories became apparent only when the latter were brought to bear upon the dispute over slavery. The assertion being made is that slavery was a volatile issue and impacted politics strongly. Now, a contrasting view of this was actually proposed by Randall. Randall asserts that slavery in itself was rather inconsequential and wasn't a major force behind the Civil War. He also goes as far as to say that slavery was not a major contention for Northern citizens or Southern citizens. The idea being that slavery was legal in the South and illegal in the North, and citizens didn't really bicker about that or argue about that, so it doesn't really matter. And Randall goes on to say that slavery was hardly a dividing force, and as such should be disregarded completely. Randall actually concludes this point by saying, the war itself should not be glibly explained in rationale of North versus South terms. Essentially saying that this is not even the point of saying the South seceded and should be stopped by the North, but rather it was like a takes two to tango scenario where the South and the North basically butted heads and were ignorant in their own rights. Now, this last point by Randall illustrates his overarching assertion that the war was a unified effort and a unified failure. Now, in contention with Randall's point, in agreement with Bestor's first point, is Paludan, who actually comes in and says early in his article that the answer is obvious at first glance and remains clear upon deeper investigation. The South receded because it saw Lincoln as a threat to the survival of slavery. His assertion is simple and explains his position thoroughly. This is indicative of Paludan's writing and rhetoric. All of these interpretations of slavery by all authors will lend to the perspective of the cessation of Southern states from this union. So you can see just from the information here, it is a fact that slavery occurred in the United States. It is a fact that slavery was illegal in the North and slavery was legal in the South at this point before the Civil War. But the interpretation of this fact is differing based on at least these two ideologies. The ideology saying that slavery was not necessarily a dividing factor, but something that existed, which is an interesting take, and it's something that's proposed by Randall here. Whereas with Bestor and Paludan, they both agree that slavery was a huge issue, it was a contributing factor, and from here we'll see their argument shift and the perspective form based on this foundation of how slavery is viewed in context of starting or igniting the Civil War. Now, the issue of cessation is not an avoidable topic as it's the major cause behind the Civil War, but it's a strongly argued topic, okay? So Bestor explains in his article that cessation was a response to the problem surrounding slavery. He contextualizes Southern states as being heavily reliant on slave labor and being an integral part of Southern society. Surprisingly, he does not view the fact as the strongest component cessation or conflict. He doesn't believe this is the only reason for this to be. Bestor asserts that the most harmful component was the shared ideology of Southern states to impose their interpretation of law on the Union. He goes as far as to say that the constitutional question of legislative authority was constantly bombarded by the storm cloud of slavery. Bestor asserts that slavery became a volatile component and a threat to the Constitution and the Union, thus making the cessation almost inevitable. Randall again contends Bestor's viewpoint. Randall views the cessation war as a mutual failure of the North and the South. Randall states, clear thinking would require a distinction between causing the war and getting into the war. He asserts that the South started the cessation, but the North poorly responded to it by starting the war, again a mutual failure. Now, Polyton stands in contention with both Randall and Bestor. His interpretation is unique in that he places more blame on the North than the South in causing cessation and the war. He actually says that the South's fear of losing slavery was so overwhelming that they ultimately chose to secede from the Union. He goes as far as to say cessation was an obvious choice because of strong social divide and really does not need to be strongly scrutinized. So the idea being that cessation seems like a natural response to what the North was doing and how important slavery was to the South, it kind of made sense for that to be the next course of action. Polyton states, the focus here is why the North fought to save the Union, not why Southerners tried to divide it, as that seems obvious. This assertion made by Polyton seeps into his interpretation of the war as the North simply trying to preserve the status quo. The simple question of whether the Civil War was avoidable returns complex arguments and answers. Randall clearly asserts the Civil War was indeed avoidable and explains that the conclusion he's drawn isn't hard to come to. Randall asserts the main reason as to why the Civil War occurred is because of poor statesmanship, and he even says all of the issues leading up to the war could not be the sole reason for its ignition. Peace was more than possible. Randall states, if one word or phrase were selected to account for the war, that word would not be slavery, nor states' rights, or diverse civilizations. It would have to be such a word as fanaticism on both sides, or misunderstanding, or perhaps politics. He places heavy emphasis on the last word, politics, later on. Randall states, peace became a matter of politics. The assertion is that the war began and continued because of arrogance and the refusal of finding a compromise, the refusal to even negotiate. Polyton follows suit with Randall. He asserts that the North refused to even fancy the idea of a cessation, and that they would not accept it. Polyton also states that the legalization of cessation was sought after, but the national government failed to deliver. He also states that the cessation would have hardly affected the northern states' way of life. Already there was a north and south divide, and that a cessation really would not have changed much, and he says that it was a minimal threat. Polyton asserts that the response of the war was enacted because Northerners feared their nation had been corrupted and partially destroyed by the South before and after cessation. The North's struggle to maintain power was the major cause of the war. Bestor's argument differs in its conclusion and approach from Randall and Polyton. Bestor first explains the issues leading up to the war could be dealt with peacefully or with force, so it was possible for the war to be avoided. Even so, Bestor explains that the Northern response was legitimate. He explains the Southerners saw the Union as a simple confederation of sovereign states, and as such, states have the power to secede. However, Bestor asserts that this argument is false and unfounded, as well as offered no solutions to the slave dilemma. As previously stated, Bestor sees the Southern states as aggressors who try to impose their ideology on the entire Union. The South was the larger transgressor in Bestor's opinion. Now, you can see from these pieces of opinions and these perspectives that there is the question of who is the larger aggressor, who is more to blame. Is it the fault of the North for not being the bigger person and accepting the cessation and being two-state solution? Or is it the fault of the South for even seceding in the first place? And was it even legitimate in a constitutional context, whether you're looking at it with strict constructionism or loose constructionism? How do you jump to the point of we can simply leave the Union if we feel like it? So with all these points considered and all these different pieces of information and the way they're presented, you can see that the Civil War is a complex topic, and the articles addressing the topic are equally complex. Bestor, Polyton, and Randall all lend their own unique perspectives on the issues behind the Civil War. Slavery was not a constant factor, and it is debated by the three authors. Ultimately, only Randall sees slavery as insignificant. In terms of cessation, the three disagree as well. Bestor and Polyton see cessation as something logical, while Randall simply sees it as mindless transgression. All three agree that the Civil War could have been avoided, but all three provide different opinions as to why. All of these authors examined the same historical event, and all authors approached addressing it differently. And same as the latter, all had drawn varying conclusions. Viewing each article is clear how the authors shaped their conclusion, and to see why they would subscribe to their thought and ideologies. To say one is right and one is wrong takes an immense amount of effort, just as it takes immense effort to try and strictly define what led to the Civil War. It is safe to say that there are no easy conclusions to be drawn, and all may have had an ounce of truth. The American Civil War is an event in history that was caused by disagreements, and it seems in its wake there are many disagreements around what caused the war. So it's very interesting to see that an event took place information is constant, but the perspective of each differs. And I think that with all this information presented, when you look at Nikki Haley's answer, it seems kind of vague and kind of shallow. She doesn't really say much. She doesn't provide much historical context. She doesn't even really talk about the events that led to the Civil War, nevertheless, the cessation of states. It's kind of like a statement of, oh, big government is bad, and I'm a Republican, and I'll make sure that you're happy. Very vague, very dishonest. I don't know if she was being malicious. I don't know if she was being ignorant, but to not mention slavery, to not mention cessation, to not mention the question of, is it constitutional? Is it legitimate to even say I secede from the Union? Because, to be honest, when Donald Trump won the presidency, California and other states said, hey, we should secede too, which already we answered that question, you can't do that. But it is legitimate to say that these events did occur and there are questions around it. And it amazes me that all these years later, there's still questions around what exactly caused the most bloodiest American war, the Civil War. And at the same time, I think it's very disingenuous to not at least mention slavery. Even Randall, who says slavery was not a big factor, had to mention it, because whether he likes to admit it or not, it was a big factor. The fact that you have to say slavery was not a big factor and try to give reasons as to why it wasn't a big factor kind of shows how deep that connection is. That's like if I were to say that the bombing of Pearl Harbor didn't have much to do with Japan. And the reason why it didn't have much to do with Japan is because Pearl Harbor could have been protected a little bit better. If a plane was coming, we could have shot it down. It basically was a big issue, and Japan wasn't a big deal. Yeah, Japan was there. Japan was doing some stuff, but it's not that big of an issue. Slavery was there. Slavery was discussed, slavery was argued about, but it's not that big of an issue. Now, when we look at these articles, it's very important to remember that these are not primary sources. These are secondary sources. What that means is someone looked at historical events, someone looked at information, they took that information and then formed an argument around it. It's very good to look at primary sources, something that is just news, historical event, empirical data that you yourself can form an opinion on. If you look at the American Civil War, to say that slavery had no role in it would actually be disingenuous, because leading up to the Civil War, there was actually the 1850s Compromise. There was actually the drawing of the Mississippi border, the line between the Mason-Dixon line, where the North had no slaves and the South had slaves. Why was that? Because slavery was a huge issue. Not only the question of, is it okay to own another human being, but I own this human being. How much do they count for a vote? It was actually decided that they count for 3/5 of a vote. It was actually decided that these slaves have some type of voting power, and that people who own these slaves have that voting power. So slavery was a huge issue, and if for some reason slavery was not abolished, it would continue to be a disagreement, and it would continue to be a very important piece in dialogue. So to say that it's not important would be extremely disingenuous when you look at the primary sources of history, where we multiple times had to address the issue of slavery and how it affected the United States, especially when it came to bringing in new states. Because when we adopted states from Mexico, when we adopted states on west of Texas, the question was, will this state have slavery or not? It's a new state. What do they want? What do the people in the state want? And different compromises were made because of that. So when it comes to Nikki Haley, I think she's probably just an airhead that doesn't have much to say about it. She more than likely just wanted to get a meme statement out there to be like, oh, I love small government, and I'm definitely your Republican candidate. And at the end of the day, when it comes to important information such as the United States Civil War, you should just look into the information yourself and form your opinions yourself, because unfortunately politics plays such a huge role in our society that we're actually discussing whether or not slavery was a factor in United States Civil War that decided whether or not slavery was okay.
At the end of every single video, make sure you ask people to rate and subscribe to your content. It makes them feel like they're involved even though they're really not. And most importantly, make sure they comment on every single video. If you have to, disguise it. You know, call it something like the question of the day. And really make them think you're gonna really read it when you really don't have to. Ha ha ha!